Under the bleak Missouri sky of 1839, the Whitmer farmhouse stood in isolation along the Boone's Lick Road, a solitary structure surrounded by overgrown fields and crooked fence posts that seemed too tired to stand. Travelers often remarked that the house appeared to lean inward as if the land itself wanted to swallow it whole. The boards were warped from years of rain and wind, the windows clouded and streaked with grime, and the chimney spewed a thin grey smoke that smelled less of wood and more of something acrid and unwelcoming. People rarely saw the family outside except at church on rare Sundays, where their solemn faces and rigid posture drew uncomfortable glances from the neighbors who wondered what sort of life was being lived inside those walls. The air around the property carried an oppressive silence, broken only by the creak of a loose shutter or the distant cry of an animal from the barn that no one dared to investigate too closely. The patriarch, Elias Whitmer, was known in town for his stern manner and his refusal to allow strangers onto his land. He was tall, gaunt, with a hooked nose and sunken eyes that seemed to look right through a person when he spoke. His wife, Martha, kept her gaze fixed on the ground whenever they were in public, her hands always clenched at her sides as if bracing herself against something unseen. They had 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, all pale and quiet, never seen playing with other children and never heard laughing. The neighbors whispered that Elias kept them home from social gatherings and schooling, insisting that what they needed to learn, they would learn under his roof and under his rules. No one dared question him too directly, as his reputation for sudden bursts of anger and threats of violence kept most at a distance. The house itself became a source of unease in the community. Some claimed to have seen candlelight flickering through the upstairs windows well past midnight, shadows moving in strange patterns against the curtains, as if there were more people inside than the family alone could account for. Others spoke of hearing sounds carried on the wind, low chanting, guttural voices, and once the sharp scream of a woman that ended so suddenly it left the listener frozen in place. Farmhands who were hired to work the fields never seemed to stay longer than a season. They would leave in the dead of night without collecting pay, their belongings left behind, and their absence never reported to the sheriff. Travelers along the road told stories of being refused shelter at the Whitmer home during storms, even when there was smoke from the fire and clear signs of someone awake inside. The road leading to the farmhouse was often found littered with strange items, scraps of cloth, a broken shoe, or in one grim instance, a blood-stained ribbon tied in a knot and nailed to a fence post. The neighbors avoided walking past at night, preferring to take the longer route into town rather than risk hearing whatever might rise from the property after dark. In the colder months, the stench from the smokehouse was strong enough to make passing horses shy away, as if some animal instinct warned them of what was being burned there. There were reports of strange pits dug behind the barn, quickly filled and tamped down by Elias and his sons, the earth still soft and damp when a neighbor happened to wander too close. By the end of that year, the Whitmer farm had become a subject of both fear and fascination. Children dared each other to approach the fence line, to look through the slats and see if they could catch a glimpse of one of the Whitmer daughters staring back from the window. Grown men admitted to feeling watched as they passed by, claiming they could see figures standing motionless on the porch, staring in total silence until the traveler was out of sight. The isolation of the house was no accident. Elias had built it far enough from town that no one could hear what happened there, and yet close enough that its presence was a constant reminder that something was very wrong. Inside the farmhouse, life was said to follow a strict and terrifying order, though few ever saw it with their own eyes. Rumors claimed that Elias kept the doors locked from the inside at night, that the family ate their meals in total silence, and that any noise after sundown could be met with harsh punishment. The girls were never seen outside without head coverings, their faces pale against the dark fabric, their movements slow and deliberate as though fear weighed on every step. Even in daylight, the house seemed cloaked in a strange stillness, a kind of dread that seeped into the soil and left visitors uneasy long after they had gone. Elias Whitmer ruled his household with an iron grip that was spoken of in fearful tones among the few who had encountered him closely enough to understand his temperament. He was not merely strict, but consumed with a belief that his authority was absolute, a belief that no law of man or church could override the order he claimed God himself had placed upon him. Those who knew him in passing described his presence as suffocating, his voice low and deliberate, every word heavy with menace. It was said that when he looked at his wife or children, they would fall silent instantly, their bodies stiffening as though bracing for a blow that might come without warning. He carried a thick hickory stick at all times, not only for herding livestock but for asserting his dominance within the home. The neighbors who dared visit claimed to have seen faint bruises on the arms of his sons and dark rings under the eyes of his daughters, though no one spoke openly of it for fear of Elias's wrath. In the Whitmer household, the father's word was not simply law, it was ritual. He dictated when the family ate, when they slept, when they prayed, and when they worked. Every member of the family was subject to inspection, their behavior scrutinized as if their very thoughts were an offense waiting to be punished. Elias was known to wake his family in the middle of the night to deliver sermons of his own making, using scripture twisted to justify his rule. He spoke of purity and obedience, but neighbors would later testify that his definition of purity was unlike anything they had ever heard preached from the pulpit. He claimed that the outside world was corrupt, that the church was blind to the truth, and that only within the walls of his own home could his family remain untainted. These sermons were not optional, they were enforced, and his family sat in silence while he ranted for hours, the candlelight casting his sharp features into something almost skeletal. The tyranny extended to every corner of the farmhouse. No door was ever left unlocked except by Elias's hand, and no one was allowed to leave the property without his permission. Martha, his wife, was seen rarely in town and never without one of her children accompanying her. If she lingered too long at the general store or spoke too warmly to a neighbor, Elias would be waiting for her at the edge of the property, his stare enough to send her hurrying home without another word. Some of the more outspoken townsfolk claimed they once heard shouting from the Whitmer home carried across the fields on a still summer night, followed by a silence so deep it felt unnatural. It was after one such night that Martha stopped coming into town entirely, and her children became even more ghost-like in their appearances, heads bowed, eyes fixed on the ground. Visitors described a tension inside the house that was almost unbearable. The air felt thick, the rooms dimly lit even in daylight, because Elias kept the shutters closed. A few unfortunate souls who had been invited inside said that the walls were lined with heavy wooden crosses and crude symbols carved into the beams, as if Elias were warding off something he believed threatened them. The dining table, long and narrow, bore deep grooves from years of use, and it was said that no one spoke while eating unless Elias asked a direct question. Punishment for disobedience was swift and often public within the family. Neighbors would later claim that Elias believed in humiliation as much as pain, forcing his children to kneel for hours on cold floors or locking them in the root cellar for entire nights until they begged for forgiveness. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Elias's rule was the growing suspicion that his obsession with control had crossed a line into something darker. Farmhands who stayed on the property for work spoke quietly of the way Elias kept the older daughters close to him, never letting them out of sight, and the way he dismissed offers from neighbors to take the girls into town for church socials or gatherings. The few who dared speak of it hinted that the daughters seemed frightened in his presence, shrinking back when he reached for them, their eyes darting to the floor. One farmhand who fled the property after only 2 weeks claimed that Elias would hold strange gatherings in the barn late at night, forcing the family to participate, though he would not speak of what he had seen beyond saying it was not natural and not godly. By the autumn of 1839, Elias's tyranny had turned the Whitmer home into a place of dread even for those who had never stepped inside. The locals began to talk of the family as cursed, their land poisoned by the sins of the father. Stories spread that Elias had begun to write in strange books, filling them with symbols and words no one could understand, and that he used these writings to justify whatever punishment or ritual he carried out under his roof. Whether out of fear or resignation, the family submitted to his rule without protest, and the farmhouse became a prison where the lines between discipline, devotion, and something far more sinister had begun to blur. The Whitmer women were rarely seen beyond the confines of their property, and when they were, their silence was unnerving to those who encountered them. They moved like shadows, heads covered, hands folded in front of them, speaking only when addressed, and even then in whispers barely audible over the wind. It was said that Martha, the mother, never looked anyone directly in the eye, and that her daughters mirrored her in every way, as though they had been trained to erase themselves from the world outside their home. There was no laughter, no chatter of girls their age, no signs of ordinary childhood mischief. Neighbors said it was as though their spirits had been hollowed out, leaving only obedience where life should have been. Whatever happened inside that farmhouse was powerful enough to strip away their voices, their confidence, even their sense of individuality, until they existed only as extensions of Elias's will. At the heart of Elias's rule were the rituals he demanded the family observe, strange ceremonies that blurred the line between religion and his own twisted desires. It was whispered that after supper he would gather them in the main room, ordering them to kneel while he recited long passages from the Bible, altering the words to suit his teachings, twisting scripture until it justified the acts he was about to commit. Some neighbors claimed to have glimpsed the family through a window, all of them kneeling in a circle with their heads bowed, Elias standing over them with one hand raised, his face contorted in fervor. These nightly rituals were not merely for prayer, but acts of control, each one reinforcing his dominance and reminding them that their lives were not their own. The Whitmer women were forced to participate, whether they wished to or not, and there were stories of screams breaking through the quiet night, followed by a heavy silence that seemed to smother the air around the house. What made these rituals most disturbing were the rumors that they involved acts no one dared speak of plainly. Farmhands who had worked on the property swore that Elias's teachings included lessons on purity that demanded the women prove their obedience to him in ways that had nothing to do with faith. One former worker claimed that the barn was sometimes used for these gatherings, that he had seen the daughters led inside late at night and not return until dawn, their faces pale and eyes swollen as though they had been crying. The man never returned to collect his pay, too shaken by what he had seen to face the patriarch again. There were also whispers that Martha herself was not spared from these rituals, that she too was subjected to Elias's demands, her submission part of the example he set for their daughters. These stories were so unsettling that most who heard them refused to repeat them aloud, for fear that speaking them might bring some kind of curse upon their own homes. The isolation of the Whitmer family ensured that no one could intervene. The road to the farm was long and muddy, and those who lived closest were too terrified of Elias to interfere. Even the local preacher, who once attempted to call on the family after hearing troubling reports, left the property shaken and pale, telling no one exactly what he had seen inside. After that visit, he never spoke of the Whitmers from the pulpit again, and some said he crossed the street when he saw Elias coming into town. Whatever he had witnessed that day, it convinced him that this was not a household that could be saved through prayer or persuasion. The Whitmer women were left to endure their lives under Elias's rule, with no hope of escape, no one willing to risk his anger on their behalf. Those who did catch glimpses of the women began to notice how their appearances changed over time. The daughters grew thinner each season, their faces gaunt, their movements slow, as though every step was weighed down by exhaustion and fear. Some neighbors believed the rituals included fasting or punishments that left the girls too weak to work the fields. Others suspected that Elias deliberately starved them as part of his control, feeding them only enough to keep them alive. Their clothing was plain and always dark, with long sleeves that hid their arms and high collars that reached to their throats. To those who saw them, it seemed as though Elias was not only controlling their actions, but erasing their very identities, turning them into living symbols of obedience. By the winter of 1839, the rumors surrounding the Whitmer women had grown into a dark mythology of their own. Children in town spoke of them as though they were ghosts, pale figures trapped in the house, forced to participate in rituals too terrible to imagine. Adults exchanged knowing looks whenever their names were mentioned, and some warned travelers not to stop near the property after sundown. It was said that if you passed too close to the house at night, you could hear faint sobbing carried on the wind, or worse, the sound of Elias's deep voice chanting words that did not sound entirely human. The silence of the Whitmer women became a symbol of the power Elias held over them, a silence so complete that it seemed to radiate from the farmhouse itself, spreading like a shadow over the road and fields until even the animals grew restless in its presence. The disappearances began quietly, at first dismissed as coincidence or the natural comings and goings of hired men looking for better pay elsewhere. The Whitmer farm, after all, was not an easy place to work. Elias was known to be harsh, his temper unpredictable, and the labor backbreaking. Yet as the months passed, the number of men who failed to return for their wages, who left their belongings behind in the bunkhouse, who vanished without sending word to their families, became impossible to ignore. By the late summer of 1839, the surrounding community had begun to whisper that something sinister was happening on the Whitmer property. Mothers warned their sons not to take work there, and travelers passing through town were quietly advised to keep riding past the Boone's Lick Road rather than seek shelter at the Whitmer place. The stories told in hushed tones around kitchen tables all shared the same chilling detail. No one ever saw the missing men leave the property alive. There were more disturbing signs than just disappearances. A tattered coat was once found snagged on the fence near the north field, stiff with dried blood, though Elias dismissed it as the remains of a wounded deer he had butchered. On another occasion, a neighbor reported finding a set of boots, half buried in mud by the creek that ran behind the Whitmer barn, one of them still containing what looked to be the shape of a foot. When asked about it, Elias only glared and said the boots were trash from a passing vagrant and not worth the sheriff's time. The sheriff did not press further, for even the law seemed reluctant to provoke the man who ruled his farm like a fortress. It was easier for the community to accept Elias's explanation than to confront the possibility that something unspeakable was taking place so close to their homes. The Whitmer barn was often at the center of these suspicions. Those who lived near enough to see it from a distance reported lantern light shining through its cracks late into the night and hearing noises that did not sound like animals. There were dull thuds, dragging sounds, and on at least one occasion, a scream cut short so abruptly that it left the listener paralyzed with fear. When dawn came, Elias would be seen outside as though nothing had happened, calmly tending to the livestock, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sometimes with dark stains at the cuffs. The ground behind the barn was disturbed so often that it became difficult to tell how many shallow pits had been dug and filled in over the course of a season. Freshly turned soil marked the property like scars, and though neighbors whispered about what might lie beneath, no one dared to dig. Travelers along Boone's Lick Road sometimes went missing too, men who had been seen in town one day and never arrived at their destination the next. The Whitmer farm sat at a lonely bend in the road, the last sign of habitation for several miles, and suspicion naturally settled there. Some claimed to have been refused shelter when they knocked on the Whitmer door during storms, hearing voices inside but being told gruffly to move along. Others claimed that Elias would sometimes appear on the road at night, standing motionless in the path until the traveler turned back the way they had come, unsettled by his silent presence. A few spoke of waking to find someone rifling through their saddlebags while they slept by the roadside, only to glimpse one of the Whitmer sons disappearing into the tree line. None of these stories could be proven, but they added to the growing dread that clung to the family's name. What frightened the community most was the belief that these disappearances were not random acts of violence, but part of something deliberate, a pattern known only to Elias himself. There were stories that he kept records of every man who had ever set foot on his property, names scratched into a ledger kept locked in a drawer. Some who claimed to have seen the book swore that certain names were crossed out with heavy strokes of ink, as though marking them gone. Whether these records were real or imagined, they fueled the fear that Elias was not just a cruel man, but a calculating one, that the vanishings were the result of decisions made coldly and without remorse. This idea turned the Whitmer farm into a place of whispered curses and uneasy glances, a spot people avoided even in daylight. By the end of the year, the disappearances had become too frequent to ignore. Men spoke of them in the tavern at night, lowering their voices as though afraid the walls might hear. The name Whitmer began to carry a weight of dread that kept strangers from asking questions and neighbors from coming too close. Yet despite all of this, no one confronted Elias directly. The fear of what they might find, and perhaps of what he might do, kept the community silent. The farm remained a dark blot on the edge of the road, its barns and fields concealing secrets that no one dared to unearth. And every time another man failed to return home, the suspicion grew that the soil around the Whitmer property was hiding far more than corn and wheat. The winter of 1839 settled over Howard County with a weight that seemed almost alive, the snow piling against fences and barns, muffling the sounds of the countryside until even the wind felt like it moved slower. The Whitmer farm became an even darker presence during those months, its windows glowing faintly in the long nights, casting shapes against the snow that some claimed were not entirely human. Smoke poured steadily from the chimney, carrying a bitter stench that made passers-by cover their faces. It was said that the snow around the barn never stayed white for long, quickly turning to a dark, rusty color in patches that suggested more than just the blood of butchered livestock. The silence of winter only amplified the sense of dread. every creak of the house or cry from the barn sounding louder, sharper, until the very air felt tense with something waiting to be discovered. Neighbors began to notice that the Whitmer women looked thinner than ever, their skin pale and chapped from the cold, their movements stiff as though they were being driven harder than usual despite the season. Some claimed to have seen them outside long after sundown, dragging heavy buckets from the creek, their skirts stiff with ice, while Elias stood in the doorway watching them work. The girls' faces were said to be hollow, their eyes distant, as if whatever they were enduring inside the house was slowly consuming them. Rumors spread that Elias had increased his rituals during the winter months, locking the family inside for hours at a time, forcing them to kneel on the frozen floor until their knees bled. One farmhand swore he had seen the daughters being led to the barn barefoot through the snow, their feet leaving streaks of red behind them as they went. The true horror of that winter came when a traveler from St. Charles, seeking shelter from a blizzard, claimed he had been turned away from the Whitmer house despite seeing light and hearing voices inside. Forced to take refuge in the woods, he watched from a distance as figures moved between the house and the barn well past midnight, carrying what appeared to be sacks over their shoulders. The man swore that when one of the figures tripped, something spilled into the snow and was hastily gathered back up, but not before he saw what he described as a pale arm, limp and small, glinting in the moonlight before being hidden again. He rode to town at first light to tell the sheriff, but by the time authorities visited the farm, the snow had been carefully cleared and packed down, leaving no evidence of what the traveler claimed to have seen. Elias met them at the door with his usual cold stare, insisting that nothing unusual had occurred and that the traveler must have been delirious from the cold. That same winter, several dogs from nearby farms went missing, and one neighbor reported finding bones scattered along the fence line, gnawed clean but not belonging to any animal he recognized. The smell from the smokehouse grew stronger, more putrid, until some swore it carried all the way to the road. When asked about it, Elias simply said he was preparing meat to last the season and that those who did not like the smell should keep their distance. This answer did little to calm the growing fear in the community, and more than one person wondered aloud if the meat being smoked on the Whitmer property was not from pigs or cattle at all. Yet no one dared press the matter further, the memory of Elias's glare enough to silence even the boldest of tongues. By midwinter, the disappearances had reached a point where they could no longer be ignored, but the snow kept anyone from investigating thoroughly. Tracks would appear in the fields leading toward the woods but never come back, as though swallowed by the earth. The ground around the barn was too frozen to dig, though some claimed to see mounds of snow shaped like shallow graves that were always gone by morning. The barn door was said to be locked at all times except when Elias himself was present, and those who passed by swore they could hear noises coming from inside, rhythmic and low, like chanting, or the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Whatever was happening on the Whitmer farm that winter, it left a stain on the community's memory that could not be washed away with the spring thaw. When the snow finally began to melt, the ground around the Whitmer property turned to mud that revealed strange things. Scraps of fabric, a broken comb, what some swore were bones too small to belong to livestock. These discoveries only deepened the sense of dread, and yet no one stepped forward to demand justice. Fear had taken hold of the town so completely that even those who suspected the truth chose to remain silent, preferring the comfort of rumor to the danger of confrontation. The Whitmer farm stood as it always had, its windows dark, its secrets buried beneath the thawing earth, waiting for the next traveler to vanish or the next night of ritual to begin. When the truth finally began to surface, it was not through confession but through fragments of evidence pieced together by terrified neighbors and a reluctant sheriff. The first real crack came when a former farmhand, pale and shaking, returned to town after vanishing for nearly a month. He refused to stay long, but before he fled for good, he spoke to the authorities about what he had seen inside the barn. His testimony was confused, fragmented, but the images he described chilled those who heard them. Figures kneeling in a circle, Elias standing over them with a lantern, and sounds that were neither prayer nor speech, but guttural chants that made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. He said there was blood on the straw floor, far more than could be explained by butchering livestock, and that in one corner of the barn he had seen something he swore was a human hand partially buried beneath loose hay. This account forced the sheriff's hand, and by late spring he assembled a small group of men to ride out to the Whitmer property and confront Elias directly. The visit to the farm became the stuff of legend in Howard County. When the sheriff and his men arrived, Elias met them on the porch, calm and unblinking, as if he had been expecting them all along. He allowed them inside without protest, which unnerved them more than if he had fought to keep them out. The house was colder than expected for the season, the windows shuttered, the air heavy with the smell of tallow and smoke. They found the family seated at the long table, silent and motionless, as though frozen in place. The daughters did not look up when spoken to, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, their faces expressionless. Martha sat at the head of the table opposite Elias, her posture rigid, her eyes glassy and red-rimmed. It was said that when the sheriff asked her if everything was all right in the household, she opened her mouth as if to speak but said nothing, only a faint breath escaping before she lowered her gaze again. When they were permitted to search the barn, what they found was enough to turn hardened men pale. The dirt floor was dark and damp in patches that smelled strongly of iron, and though Elias claimed it was animal blood from slaughtering hogs, there were signs that something far larger had been dragged across the ground. In the corner of the barn they discovered a pile of burlap sacks, some stained and stiff, and beneath them a wooden crate containing bones that the town doctor later confirmed were human. The sheriff ordered the barn dug out, and by nightfall they had uncovered more bones, some belonging to adults and some unmistakably small enough to belong to children. The men who dug refused to continue after dark, claiming the lantern light cast shadows that moved on their own, and they left the property swearing never to set foot there again. The most damning evidence came from Elias's personal writings, discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the house. The journals were filled with strange symbols, rambling scripture references, and detailed accounts of his so-called rituals, describing how he believed he was purifying his family through acts that the court would later call unspeakable. He wrote of blood offerings, of trials by pain, of keeping the women under his control to prevent what he called the corruption of the outside world. There were even lists of names, some of them familiar to the townsfolk as the very men who had gone missing, marked with notes about their fate. These writings were brought into the courtroom during Elias's trial, read aloud to a horrified audience that reportedly wept and prayed as the clerk recited each passage. The testimony of the surviving family members, once they were removed from the house, only deepened the horror, confirming that the rituals had taken place regularly and that disobedience was punished in ways too terrible to recount in full. The trial became a spectacle, drawing crowds from neighboring towns who came to see the man they now called the Devil of Boone's Lick Road. Elias never denied the charges, speaking calmly from the stand about his beliefs and insisting that he had only been carrying out the will of God as he understood it. His lack of remorse turned the proceedings into a kind of waking nightmare, each day revealing darker truths about what had happened on that lonely farm. Witnesses spoke of screams heard in the night, of strange fires seen burning in the fields, of the smell of burning flesh that hung in the air for days at a time. By the time the trial concluded, even the judge was said to be visibly shaken, his gavel trembling as he pronounced the sentence. The transcripts of those proceedings would later be stored under lock and key, considered too disturbing for public circulation. Yet copies still found their way into private hands, where they were read in secret for decades afterward, keeping the memory of the Whitmer horrors alive long after the farmhouse itself had been abandoned. When the verdict was finally handed down, the town gathered outside the courthouse, a sea of grim faces illuminated by torchlight, as word spread that Elias Whitmer had been sentenced to hang. Yet even with justice declared, the story did not end, for the community feared that the evil of the Whitmer farm would not die with its master. After the trial, the family was returned to the property under guard to collect what little belongings they had, and witnesses said the daughters wept as they crossed the threshold, their thin shoulders shaking as though they were stepping back into a tomb. Elias was kept in the county jail to await his execution, but even locked behind bars, he remained unshaken, speaking calmly to anyone who would listen, promising that his work was not done and that others would carry on where he left off. These words left the jailers uneasy, and some refused to spend the night watch near his cell, claiming they heard him whispering to unseen presences in the dark. It was in the weeks following his sentencing that the community made a decision that would forever mark the Whitmer property as cursed. A group of men from the town, acting under no official order, rode out one night with torches and kerosene, determined to rid themselves of the place once and for all. They surrounded the farmhouse, the barn and the smokehouse, dousing the walls until the wood was slick and shining, then lit them alight. The fire spread quickly, a roaring blaze that lit up the winter sky and could be seen from miles away. Some claimed they heard screams coming from inside the house even though it was supposed to be empty, and others swore they saw figures moving behind the windows just before the roof collapsed. Whether those shapes were tricks of the firelight or something else entirely, no one could say, but when the flames finally died, nothing was left of the Whitmer home but blackened timbers and smoking earth. In the aftermath, strange stories began to circulate about the ruins. Travelers claimed their horses refused to pass near the property, rearing and sweating as though sensing something unseen. Hunters reported finding bones scattered in the ashes, some of them charred but still unmistakably human. One of the deputies who had dug in the barn during the investigation swore he saw fresh footprints in the mud near the remains of the house days after the fire, though no one had been near the place since. The land seemed to resist being reclaimed. Seeds would not take root in the soil, and grass grew in twisted patches as though scorched from beneath. Neighbors began to say that at night, when the wind blew just right, they could still smell the acrid smoke of that night and hear faint chanting carried over the fields.